First things first, this is not a historically accurate pattern for a true corset, as an undergarment or as a form of shapewear, hence why I am making the distinction in calling it a corset top. This top is not made of the proper fabric for tight lacing or really anything more than very basic support. All in all, it's meant to be a pretty outer layer. I am using this floral cotton fabric as the top layer, and a sturdier cotton twill fabric as the lining layer, which is black. The pattern does call for interfacing, which is what you add to make the fabric stiffer or more sturdy. But I decided against using it this time because of the tighter weave of my lining fabric, making the garment sturdy enough without it, in my opinion. So to reiterate, this is not an accurate corset as an undergarment. However, I will be using many similar techniques in making this fashion corset top that I have used in the past to make more accurate corsets. If you'd like to see a video about this, please leave a comment below. Before filming, I traced the pattern pieces onto this tracing paper and cut out 2 of each piece on both the floral fabric and later the lining fabric. The exception to this is piece 7, or the Modesty panel, which is only cut once from the floral fabric, or the outer layer. After the cutting is finished, I unpinned each pattern piece from the fabric and carefully transferred the markings in chalk to the fabric itself. These markings will let me know which pieces are which by numbering them, and the notches on the side tell me where to match them together, alongside other pieces of the corset top. This pattern calls for stay stitching parts of the pieces 1 and 2 on both the outer and inner layers of the corset top. Stay stitching is when you add a tighter row of stitches along what is typically a curved edge in order to stop the fabric from stretching out before you sew it. Now I am stitching pieces 1 and 2, also known as the front and side pieces, together in both the outer floral layer and the inner black layer. Then you can sew all the lining layers together and the outer layers together, done exactly as shown for pieces 1 and 2. I cut into the seam allowance or inlay between pieces 1 and 2 by cutting into the seam in a V shape. It lets the fabric curve more easily, reducing the chance of bulk around the seam allowance underneath. This is done on both inner and outer layers. Here I am attaching the Modesty panel, or piece 7, to the inner lining layer. You want to sew this on the side of the fabric that does not have the visible seam allowances, or the right side of the fabric that looks a bit neater in comparison. An inch or so of the black lining layer should be free underneath piece 7 in order to add grommets for lacing later on. I bought plastic boning for this project that already comes with fabric casing around it in order to save some time. However, you can use plastic zip ties for this very easily for a cheaper or more readily available alternative if you would prefer. You would only need to make the fabric casing yourself to envelop the plastic boning in order to ensure that it doesn't poke against your skin or is too visible once your corset top is finished. I am just holding up the boning and its casing against the length of the inner seam allowance on the wrong side of the fabric. Just means that the seam allowances are visible, and cutting it to the proper length. In order to avoid confusing myself later, off screen I wrote the placement of each bone on the casing in pencil. 1-2, for example, if the bone would sit in the seam allowance between pieces 1 and 2, and so on, to keep them organized. Once the bones are cut to the appropriate length, I trim each side 1/2 inch and file down any jagged edges, in order to prevent the bones from causing any discomfort against my skin and to prevent them from poking outside of their fabric casing. After I filed them down, I hand sew the edges of each end of the fabric casing closed and use a simple knot to tie off the thread. Cut off the excess fabric casing once finished. In purple, you can see that for the bones on the inner seam, I will cut down and file 10 pieces of boning for this particular corset top. This took a while and I kept putting it off, so this took me a few days to do. Here I chose to hand sew the bones into place against the seam allowance of the inner lining fabric, also known as the wrong side of the fabric, since this is a side of the fabric that will be hidden once we sew our outer layer on top. Strictly speaking, this part isn't necessary to do. In fact, in the butterick pattern I am using, it does not include this step. However, I prefer to hand sew the bones in place using both sides of the fabric casing in order to prevent the bones from shifting around out of place in the future, because this will ruin the fit of the garment by having bulky plastic sticking sideways and being a pain to fix after everything is already sewn together. If I were to sew these again, instead of hand sewing straight down the sides through the lining fabric itself, you could also sew the bones to the seam allowance instead. This would make sure your stitches were hidden from view completely. I clipped together the outer floral fabric layer to the inner lining layer, wrong sides together. This means that the seam allowances on each layer are pressed together and will be hidden from view completely since we are sewing these two layers together permanently. For now though, I am hand basting these layers together with large stitches. It can be messy and visible because I will remove these basting stitches once I have finished sewing these layers together permanently on the sewing machine. Basting is useful because it will reduce the chances of the pieces moving around too much once at the machine, and it makes it easier to maneuver. At both ends of the corset top, or each side on piece 5, I will add this green bias tape, sewing one edge first on the floral fabric side, folding it over to completely encase the raw edge of the fabric inside, then slip stitch by hand the bias tape to the black lining fabric. Be careful to make sure you sew the bias tape to the edge of the corset piece 5 and not the Modesty panel. The bias tape will protect the raw edge of the fabric from wear and tear. For this corset top, you slip in another piece of boning on each end within the bias tape, which will act like the white fabric casing, like with the boning on the inner seams. I follow the same steps as before, cutting the boning to length, filing it down, the only difference being I slipped the plastic boning into the opening of the bias tape and hand sewed the top and bottom edges shut. Here, I am sewing the bias tape against the floral outer fabric. At this stage, I am sewing all layers of fabric together at once with the bias tape. I'll do this first on either side of the corset, then on the top and bottom of the corset. My battery died, so unfortunately I did not get any footage of that part, but it is basically the exact thing that I'm doing here, just on all the different sides of the corset. After using my sewing machine to sew the bias tape on the top and bottom of the corset top, I flip over the bias tape to enclose the raw edge of the fabric in between it. Then hand sew the free edge down to the lining using a slip stitch again. I do this all around the corset top, folding over the bias tape on the smaller curves like the top of the shoulder straps, and using the clips to hold down the fabric while I sewed it into place. The slip stitch does not go through the outer fabric, which is why I keep flipping over my corset top to check that my needle isn't poking through to be visible on the floral fabric layer. I am trying to sew the green bias tape and just feed my needle through the black lining fabric, not the outer layer. At the ends of the bias tape on the top and the bottom of the corset top, I make sure to fully encase this layer of bias tape on top of the bias tape that I already sewed on piece 5 on either side of the corset top. By doing so, I can whip stitch the opening on the side closed in order to ensure that it covers it completely and ensure that the bones in piece 5 will always stay in place. I picked up this gadget at a thrift shop when I was on vacation. Here I am using it to cut holes for the grommets. Grommets are those metal circles that you see most often on shoelaces. They will allow the corset top to be laced up very easily. I have an awl to make holes for the fabric. An awl is a sharp tool that opens a hole in the fabric by forcing a hole in the weave of the threads instead of cutting threads, because that can lead to fraying later on. However, my awl was not making holes large enough for the grommet size that I had on hand, and therefore I decided to use this tool to cut the holes since it was much simpler. Technically, this tool can be used to apply grommets too, but the pressure was a bit off, so I decided to go the old-fashioned way and use the grommet setting tool that came with these grommets and a rubber mallet. After getting the rubber mallet, I hit the grommet far too many times. All in all, I found 3 good hits was probably enough, not 20. And using this method, I set all the grommets in place on either side of the corset top and on either shoulder strap as well. I measured out 18 inches of green ribbon for the shoulder straps. I cut the ribbon at an angle and quickly dip it into the fire of a candle. The heat of the flame will melt the plastic polyester of the ribbon and ensure it doesn't fray after being cut. There are many different ways you can thread up a corset or corset top. I had this knotting cord on hand for other crafts, and it works well for me, so that's what I used here. I usually use two different ways of getting this corset top on by myself. The first is shown here. I lace it up first while I am not wearing it, which can help if you're trying to lace it up in a fancier style for a more dramatic effect. I am using a simple style since it is also simpler to remove when you can't see behind you. You can leave two loops purposely longer in the middle back in order to make lacing it up yourself easier later on. These are referred to as bunny ear loops. I tried to tie up my hair here in order to keep it out of the way while lacing up the corset top. That did not work since my hair stick immediately falls off as soon as I get the corset top over my head. After pulling down the corset top into place, use the bunny ear loops you left longer to pull the lacing to fit securely from the middle. For this corset top, it is made to fit comfortably and does not have any space left in the middle once laced to fit me snugly. If you wanted a corset that would reduce the size of your waist or achieve a more hourglass shape, it is actually made smaller than your finished measurements in that tougher fabric in order to leave extra space in this gap in the back to account for a waist reduction. However, this corset top is meant to be a pretty outer layer, and as such, I am not trying to achieve any type of reduction here. Another way to lace up the corset is to simply lace it up on yourself from the beginning. Leaving my arms out of the straps, I lace it up backwards first. Then I'll shimmy the corset top around, slide my arms into the straps, and lace it up tightly all at once. This can be a better option if you have your hair styled and don't want to ruin it, or if you have a lot of makeup on that you don't want to risk slathering on the inside of the corset top. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Please comment below if you'd like to see a more historically accurate corset construction video, if you would prefer more of a tutorial or an overview, and anything you'd like to see really in the next video. That's it for now. Thank you so much.